The year is 1944. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, roughly halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland, there is a small piece of land that most people have never heard of. It is 8 square kilometers, barely larger than a mid-sized city park. From the air, it looks like a gray-black teardrop, narrow at the south end where a dormant volcano rises from the water, widening slightly toward the flat plateau of its northern end. The beaches are dark. The sand is volcanic ash, coarse and black, not the white tropical sand that the word island usually brings to mind. The ground smells faintly of sulfur. In certain areas, steam rises from cracks in the earth. Almost nothing grows here. The soil, such as it is too acidic, too unstable, too hot near the volcanic vents. There is no fresh water on the surface. There is no natural harbor. There is no reason in any normal understanding of the word to want this island. And yet, by the summer of 1944, it had become one of the most strategically critical pieces of land in the entire Pacific. The reason was geometry. The American military had captured the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, and from those islands, the long-range B-29 bomber could reach the Japanese home islands. The bombing campaign against Japan had begun, but the route from the Marianas to Japan passed directly over Iwo Jima. Japanese radar on the island gave Tokyo hours of warning before American bombers arrived. Japanese fighter planes based on the island harassed the B-29s during their flight, and the island offered no emergency landing option for damaged American aircraft limping back from raids over Japan. Capture Iwo Jima, and all of that changed. The radar warning was eliminated. The fighter harassment was eliminated. And suddenly there was an airfield sitting in the middle of the Pacific, close enough to Japan to be genuinely useful, where damaged aircraft could land rather than ditch in the ocean. The calculation was straightforward. The execution would be anything but. By June 1944, Japanese commanders in Tokyo understood exactly what the American planners understood. If Iwo Jima fell, the air campaign against Japan would become significantly more effective. The island had to be held. And the man they chose to hold it, a general who had lived in the United States, who understood American military doctrine, who respected American fighting capacity, and was under no illusions about what was coming, sat down with his engineering teams and began to plan something that had never quite been attempted before. Not a defense of the beaches, not a last stand charge, a defense of the earth itself. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944 with roughly 21,000 men, limited supplies, and a clear-eyed understanding of his situation. He had spent time in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s, serving as a military attaché. He had traveled the country, observed its industry, spoken with its people. He had written letters home to his family describing America's productive capacity and organizational culture with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew what was coming. He knew the numbers. He had no expectation of receiving significant reinforcement. The supply lines to Iwo Jima were increasingly vulnerable to American submarines and aircraft, and as 1944 progressed, the flow of men and material to the island became less and less reliable. What he had was the island itself. 21 square kilometers of volcanic rock, honeycombed with natural tunnels and caves, heated from below by geothermal activity, surrounded on all sides by ocean. And he had 8 months, from June 1944 to February 1945, before the American fleet arrived. He used every day of it. The strategy Kurabayashi designed was a fundamental departure from the defensive doctrine that Japanese forces had used throughout the Pacific War. The standard approach, concentrated defense at the beaches, with mass charges when that defense broke, had failed on island after island. American naval firepower was too accurate and too sustained. A force defending an exposed beach had no protection from naval guns firing from miles offshore. Kuribayashi's plan eliminated the beach defense almost entirely. His men would not meet the Americans at the water's edge. They would let them come ashore. They would let them walk inland. And then from positions inside the rock, from tunnels that the naval bombardment could not reach, they would engage. The construction that followed was extraordinary in its scale and in the conditions under which it took place. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima is workable with the right tools, softer in some areas than it appears from the outside. But the environment inside the tunnels being dug was extreme. Temperatures near the geothermal vents reached 50 degrees Celsius. The volcanic gases required workers to wear protective breathing equipment. The rock itself was unstable in certain areas, requiring constant shoring. Despite all of this, by February 1945, the Japanese garrison had constructed approximately 18 kilometers of tunnels, connecting positions across the entire island. The network ran through multiple levels, shallower passages for movement and fighting positions, deeper chambers for command, medical facilities, storage. The whole structure was designed so that the loss of one section did not compromise the others. The island that the American fleet would see when it arrived looked, from the outside, almost empty. That was exactly what Kuribayashi intended. At the southern tip of Iwo Jima, the dormant volcano rises 169 meters above sea level. From its summit, on a clear day, you can see the entire island laid out below. Every beach, every approach, every piece of ground that any invading force would have to cross. It is, in purely geographic terms, the dominant feature of the landscape. Anyone holding that summit holds the commanding view of everything below it. The Japanese did not just hold the summit, they built inside the mountain. Mount Suribachi, which translates roughly as grinding bowl in Japanese, a reference to its bowl-shaped crater, was converted over 8 months of engineering work into a 7-level fortress. The natural volcanic rock was carved out floor by floor. Stairways connected the levels. Chambers were built at each depth for different purposes. Observation posts near the top, fighting positions lower, command facilities and medical rooms deeper still, where they were beyond the reach of any bomb then in use. The gun emplacements built into the mountain slopes were designed to be nearly invisible. Steel doors set into the rock face could be opened to allow a weapon to fire and then closed again immediately afterward. From a distance, from a ship offshore, from an aircraft, the mountain's surface showed nothing. No obvious gun barrels, no visible construction, just rock. The communication system inside Suribachi and throughout the tunnel network was hardwired, physical cables running through the tunnels rather than radio. This was a deliberate choice. American signal intelligence had become sophisticated enough that radio communications could be located and triangulated. A cable-based system produced no detectable signal. Instructions could move from the command center deep in the mountain to fighting positions anywhere on the island without leaving any electromagnetic trace. The tunnels that ran from Suribachi toward the rest of the island allowed the movement of men and supplies underground, out of sight of American observers. A unit that appeared to be in one part of the island could relocate to another position without ever appearing on the surface. The entire garrison could, in theory, shift its center of gravity without being detected from above. From the summit of Suribachi, Japanese observers had a complete view of the surrounding sea. When the American fleet appeared on the horizon, they could watch every ship, every movement, every change in formation. They could track the approach of landing craft as they organized for the beach assault. They could relay targeting information to gun positions throughout the island through the hardwired network. For the men inside Suribachi on February 19, 1945, the task was simple in concept and brutal in practice. Let the Americans come, watch them land, wait for the order, and then open the doors. Before the first American Marines set foot on Iwo Jima, the island was subjected to one of the most prolonged pre-invasion bombardments of the Pacific War. For 72 days before the landing, American naval and air forces struck the island on an almost daily basis. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers positioned offshore fired hundreds of thousands of shells. Aircraft dropped bombs across every visible position. The smoke from the impacts was sometimes thick enough to obscure the island entirely from the ships standing offshore. When the bombardment finally lifted and reconnaissance aircraft flew over the island, the assessment was largely positive. The surface positions appeared heavily damaged. The visible gun emplacements looked destroyed. The island looked, from above, like a landscape that had been thoroughly worked over. What the aerial photographs could not show, what no instrument available in February 1945 could reveal with any accuracy, was what was happening below the surface. The tunnels were intact. The chambers were intact. The hardwired communication network was intact. 21,000 men were in position underground, waiting, having survived the entire pre-invasion bombardment by being below it. Kuribayashi's orders to his garrison were specific. Do not fire at the landing craft. Do not fire at the men on the beach as they arrive. Wait. Let them come ashore. Let them move inland. Let them believe the island is theirs. And when the beaches are full, when the concentration of men and equipment is at its maximum, then engage. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the first waves of United States Marines came ashore on the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. For the first 20 minutes, there was almost no resistance. The men moved up the beach. They found the volcanic sand unexpectedly deep and unstable, each step sinking into ash that provided no firm footing. The black sand was hot. The landscape was strange and stark and quiet. Some of the men later described a feeling of unease that they couldn't explain at the time. Not the fear of incoming fire, the fear of something that wasn't there yet. They were right to feel it. At a signal passed through the underground communication network, the island woke up. From inside the rock, from positions that had been invisible to 72 days of aerial observation, the Japanese garrison opened fire. The Marines on the beach, crossing ground that had been precisely range measured months in advance, were suddenly in a situation that no amount of rehearsal had fully prepared them for. The fire was coming from everywhere and from nowhere visible. The terrain that trapped their feet was holding them in the kill zones that Kuribayashi's engineers had mapped out before the first American ship appeared on the horizon. The battle for Iwo Jima had begun, and it would last 36 days. The American commanders who planned the invasion of Iwo Jima expected the battle to last 5 days. This estimate was based on the pattern established in earlier Pacific operations. The initial landing was always the most dangerous phase. A force exposed on the beach, vulnerable to concentrated defense, taking its heaviest casualties in the first hours. But once the landing force was ashore and moving inland, the pattern on most islands had been relatively consistent. Organized Japanese resistance collapsed within days as American firepower and numbers overwhelmed fixed defensive positions. On Iwo Jima, that pattern did not hold. The Marines pushing inland found themselves fighting an enemy they could rarely see, in terrain that seemed to generate fire from everywhere simultaneously. A position that was cleared in the morning might be occupied again by nightfall. Japanese fighters moving through the underground network to reappear in areas that had been secured. The concept of a front line, the clear boundary between held territory and contested territory that organizes conventional military thinking, was almost meaningless on Iwo Jima. The front was wherever the tunnels went. Naval gunfire, which had been so decisive in earlier operations, lost much of its utility. The Japanese were underground. Shells that hit the surface created noise and disruption, but did not penetrate to where the defenders were positioned. The landscape above ground could be reduced to rubble, and much of it was, without significantly affecting the garrison's ability to continue fighting. The American response was to develop new methods in real time. Flamethrower teams, Marines carrying the heavy, cumbersome equipment that projected a stream of burning fuel, moved against individual tunnel openings and cave mouths, attempting to make positions untenable through heat and fire. Demolitions teams followed, placing explosive charges to seal entrances in collapsed tunnels. Armored vehicles equipped with flamethrowers, the Sherman tank variant that combat troops called the Zippo, provided heavier versions of the same capability. These methods were effective against individual positions. They were effective one cave at a time, one tunnel opening at a time. The problem was the scale. There were hundreds of tunnel openings across the island. There were positions that had multiple entrances, multiple exits, connecting passages that allowed defenders to withdraw from one opening and reappear at another. Clearing the island required clearing every one of them. The progress was measured in meters per day. On some days it was measured in meters per hour. The men doing this work were operating in extreme heat, in difficult terrain, under sustained fire from positions they often could not locate until they were nearly on top of them. The casualty figures climbed day by day in ways that the original 5-day estimate had not remotely accounted for. On the 5th day of the battle, the day the original planners had expected the fight to be over, the Marines were still on the southern portion of the island. The northern plateau, where the tunnel network was deepest and most extensive, remained entirely in Japanese hands. On February 23, 1945, 4 days into the battle, a patrol of Marines from the 28th Regiment reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. The climb had taken 4 days of difficult fighting. The tunnel network inside the mountain had been contested position by position. But by the morning of February 23rd, the summit was reachable, and a small patrol worked its way up through the volcanic rock to the top. They raised an American flag. A photographer named Joe Rosenthal, who had come ashore with the press contingent, was positioned to capture a second, larger flag being raised later the same morning. His photograph, 6 men straining against the weight of a flagpole, the flag unfurling above them, Suribachi's slopes falling away below, was transmitted back to the United States within hours. The reaction at home was immediate and overwhelming. The image appeared on front pages across the country. It was reproduced on posters, on stamps, in magazines. It became almost instantly one of the most recognized photographs ever taken. For a public that had been living with the war for more than 3 years, the image of the flag going up over a Pacific island felt like a turning point, like an announcement that the end was in sight. The men on the island knew differently. The capture of Suribachi was significant. It removed the observation platform that had allowed Japanese commanders to watch the entire island. But Suribachi was the southern tip. The rest of the island, the wider northern plateau where the tunnel network was most extensive, where the bulk of the Japanese garrison remained, where the most difficult terrain was concentrated, had barely been touched. The northern plateau contained a series of ridges and hills that the Marines would name, with grim simplicity, for what they found there. The area they called the Meat Grinder, Hill 382, the Amphitheater, Turkey Knob. These were positions where the tunnel network was so dense and the defensive engineering so thorough that the fighting became something almost beyond the normal vocabulary of military description. Units spent entire days taking a single ridge, only to find the following morning that defenders had moved through the underground network and were back in positions they had been driven from the day before. The psychological effect on the men doing the fighting was cumulative and severe. Progress felt impossible. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Night brought its own challenges. Japanese fighters emerging from tunnel openings to move through the American lines, relying on the darkness and their knowledge of the tunnel system to create disruption and confusion. The 5-day battle was by this point already a memory. The fighting on the northern plateau would continue for weeks. Iwo Jima has no rivers, no lakes, no springs that produce drinkable water at the surface. The rainfall on the island is limited, and what falls evaporates quickly in the volcanic heat of the ground. For the Japanese garrison living underground through February and March of 1945, Water was the defining problem of survival. The engineering that had made the tunnel system so formidable as a military position could not solve the basic biological requirement of having enough clean water to keep 21,000 people alive. The solutions that were developed were extreme and in some cases barely adequate. Rainwater was collected from every available surface. Condensation from the rock walls of deeper chambers was harvested. In areas near geothermal activity, steam was captured and cooled, producing small amounts of distilled water. Some accounts describe the collection of moisture from volcanic emissions, a process that required filtering out the sulfurous compounds that made the steam toxic before the water component could be used. The result was a water supply that was genuinely insufficient for the garrison's needs throughout the battle. Severe dehydration became a factor in the physical condition of the defenders as the weeks progressed. Combined with the heat inside the tunnels near geothermal areas, the poor air quality in sections with limited ventilation, and the nutritional deterioration from limited food supplies, the physical condition of the garrison deteriorated steadily from the first days of the battle. The medical facilities deep inside the tunnel system dealt with an increasing volume of patients under conditions that were extremely difficult. Surgical operations were performed by lamplight in chambers carved from volcanic rock. Anesthetics and medicines were limited from the beginning and diminished further as the battle progressed and resupply became impossible. The hardwired communication network allowed the medical staff to receive information about casualties across the island, but doing anything about that information was constrained by everything else. Kuribayashi, throughout this period, remained in communication with the remaining command elements through the tunnel network. His messages to Tokyo, some of which were preserved and later translated, are documents of remarkable clarity and restraint. He did not dramatize the situation or request the impossible. He reported conditions accurately: the water shortage, the diminishing ammunition, the deterioration of the garrison's physical condition. He expressed confidence in his men. He did not ask for rescue because he knew rescue was not coming. In one message, he noted that he could not provide his soldiers with milk or adequate water. The phrasing is simple, almost clinical. What it describes is a community of men, underground in a volcanic island, dying slowly from thirst and exhaustion while continuing to execute the mission they had been given. The gap between the starkness of the language and the magnitude of what it describes is one of the most striking things in the documentary record of the battle. The Battle of Iwo Jima holds a specific place in the history of the Pacific War that is different from any other engagement of that conflict. It is the only battle in the entire Marine Corps history in which American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. This fact, stated plainly, requires a moment to absorb. In every other major engagement of the Pacific War, every island, every beach, every prepared defensive position that American forces assaulted, the defending Japanese force suffered more casualties than the attackers. The combination of American naval firepower, air superiority, and the sustained combat effectiveness of well-supplied ground forces produced consistent results. On Iwo Jima, those conditions all applied. The American fleet offshore was the largest naval force assembled in the Pacific to that point. Air superiority was total. Japanese aviation had ceased to be an effective force by early 1945. The Marine divisions that landed were experienced, well-equipped, and professionally capable. And yet, over 36 days of fighting, the American forces suffered approximately 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 men was almost entirely lost. Fewer than 220 survivors were taken prisoner from a force that had started the battle at full strength. The numbers are a direct measure of what the tunnel system achieved as a military engineering project. Kuribayashi's objective had never been to win the island in any conventional military sense. He had known from the beginning that the island would eventually fall. His objective was to make taking it as costly as possible, to demonstrate to American planners what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would require. Every day he extended the battle, every casualty he imposed, was a data point he intended to influence the strategic calculation being made in Washington. In this specific and limited sense, the defense of Iwo Jima achieved what it set out to achieve. The casualty figures from Iwo Jima entered directly into the planning assessments for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands. The projected casualties for that operation, informed in part by what had happened on Iwo Jima, reached numbers that became a significant factor in the decision to use the atomic bomb in August 1945. Kuribayashi never knew this. He died in March 1945, before the battle officially ended, leading the last organized movement of what remained of his garrison. His body was never found, but the record he created, 8 kilometers of tunnels, 36 days of resistance, an island held by a garrison that was outnumbered, outsupplied, and systematically running out of water, remained in the military literature for decades. It is studied in military academies not as a success in the conventional sense, but as a case study in the relationship between defensive engineering, terrain, and the limits of what firepower alone can achieve. By the third week of March 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima was approaching its end. The American declaration of the island's capture was coming. The organized resistance of the Japanese garrison was collapsing, not because the remaining defenders had stopped fighting, but because there were too few of them left, in too few positions, to sustain a coordinated defense. What remained was a final chapter that the official battle records handle in a few sentences, but that the human dimension of the story requires more careful attention. Kuribayashi in the last days gathered whatever remained of his command. The messages he sent to Tokyo in this period were his final communications. He expressed his soldiers' commitment. He noted the conditions, the water, the supplies, the diminishing numbers. He thanked the Japanese people for their support. He did not dramatize. He did not request anything. He signed off on what he knew were his last communications with a directness and composure that those who studied the records afterward consistently remarked upon. In the early hours of March 26, 1945, a final organized movement emerged from the tunnel system and engaged American positions in the northern part of the island. It was not a large force by the standards of the battle. It was what was left. The engagement that followed was brief and confused in the darkness. By morning, it was over. Kuribayashi's body was never found. Extensive searches after the battle and in subsequent years as the island was surveyed located the remains of thousands of Japanese soldiers in the tunnel system. The generals were not among them. Whether he fell in the final movement and his remains were lost in the chaos, whether he remained somewhere in the deeper tunnel system and was not found, or whether something else happened in those last hours, no one knows. It remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions of the battle. Of the 21,000 men of the Iwo Jima garrison, fewer than 220 survived the battle as prisoners. The rest of the island's story is in the tunnels, in the physical infrastructure that took 8 months to build, that sustained a garrison for 36 days of sustained assault, and that in many sections has never been fully explored. The island was declared secure on March 26th. The fighting continued in isolated pockets for weeks after that. Individual or small groups of defenders who remained in the tunnel system and continued to resist for as long as they could sustain themselves. 2 soldiers, Yamakage Kufuku and Matsudo Linsoki, were not found and taken prisoner until January 1949, nearly 4 years after the battle officially ended. They had lived in the tunnel system throughout, surviving on what the island provided, unaware that the war had ended. The island kept its dead in ways that are still not fully resolved. Excavation efforts in the decades since the battle have located and recovered thousands of sets of remains from the tunnel system. As of recent years, thousands more are believed to remain unrecovered in collapsed or inaccessible sections of the network. Iwo Jima today is a Japanese military installation. It is not open to civilian visitors. Access is restricted to authorized military personnel and on specific occasions to delegations participating in memorial ceremonies for the soldiers of both nations who are still interred in the island's tunnels. The volcanic rock that Kuribayashi's engineers carved by hand through the summer and fall of 1944 is still there. The tunnels they built are still there, some collapsed, some still navigable in sections. The black sand beaches where the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, look much as they did then. Dark, coarse, hemmed in by the same volcanic terrain. The summit of Suribachi still overlooks the same water. What the Battle of Iwo Jima left behind, beyond the physical site and the unrecovered remains, is a body of military analysis that has influenced defensive planning and assault doctrine for every decade since 1945. The lesson most consistently drawn is the one that Kuribayashi designed into the defense from the beginning. Terrain, used with sufficient ingenuity and prepared with sufficient time, can impose costs on a technologically superior attacking force that the attacker cannot easily calculate in advance. The pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima was one of the heaviest of the Pacific War. It achieved far less than anyone involved expected it to achieve, because the defenders were not where the bombs were landing. They were below. The relationship between surface firepower and underground defense is not a new military problem. It appears in conflicts throughout history, but Iwo Jima formalized it in the modern military consciousness in a way that has not been forgotten. Every subsequent discussion of how to assault a fortified underground position, from military manuals to planning conferences to the analysis of specific engagements in later conflicts, carries some trace of what happened on that 8-square-kilometer volcanic island in early 1945. The photograph that Joe Rosenthal took on February 23rd, the flag going up over Suribachi, became one of the most reproduced images in American history. It was used in bond drives, in recruitment posters, in every available form of wartime communication. It served the purpose it was put to, but the men who raised that flag knew, as they did it, that the battle was nowhere near over. The island that looked like it was being claimed was still mostly underground, still mostly defended, still doing exactly what its architect had designed it to do. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Naval Forces, wrote an assessment of the battle that has been quoted in military literature ever since. He wrote that the Marines on Iwo Jima demonstrated uncommon valor as a common virtue. The phrase honored the Marines, but it also acknowledged something about the island itself, that what they were asked to do there was genuinely extraordinary, and that the fact they did it tells you something about the upper range of what people are capable of when necessity offers no other option. On both sides of the battle, that is what Iwo Jima represents. Not the most technologically sophisticated engagement of the war, not the largest, but one of the most complete tests of what human endurance, applied to the problem of defending and taking a piece of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, actually looks like when it runs to its limits. The island still holds most of its dead. The tunnels are still there. The black sand is still warm from the earth below.